Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Anthony Priori. I'm the digital marketing manager at TPGi. We're just going to wait 1 minute as people sign in, and then we'll get started briefly. Still see a couple people trickling in, so we're just going to give it 1 more minute, but we'll get started briefly. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Agile and Accessible User Experiences with AT User Flow Testing with David Sloan, Chief Accessibility Officer, and Isabel Holdsworth, Senior Accessibility Engineer. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items I'd like to get to. So firstly, this session is being recorded and we will email everyone the recording after the event. Secondly, we have captions available, so feel free to use those as needed. Next, we will have time for a live Q&A later in the webinar, so please use the Q&A box and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the presentation. I just encourage you to use the Q&A box because sometimes if you send your questions to the chat, they can get lost. So the Q&A box is a little easier for us to monitor and keep track of everything. And then lastly, if anyone needs any accessibility support, training, or usability testing, we will send out an email with a link to speak with one of our experts. So with that, I'm going to pass it off to our presenters to provide some introduction for themselves. Take it away.
Thanks, Anthony. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on Agile and Accessible User Experiences with AT User Flow Testing. So my name's David Sloan. I have two hats at TPGi and Vispero. I'm Chief Accessibility Officer, and I'm also the manager of our user experience service delivery team. And with me presenting this webinar is Isabel Holdsworth.
Hello, everyone. So I'm an assistive technology engineer at TPGi. I'm totally blind. I use a screen reader called JAWS, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. I've done various things in the past. So I've been a web developer, a C++ programmer, database administrator. So I'm pretty comfortable with what makes websites and applications tick. So I think I'm a good person to do user testing.
And there's a bit of a Celtic flavour to this presentation. I'm from Scotland. Isabel's from Northern Ireland. So,
but we've both defected.
yes.
So I'm currently in England.
And I'm currently in the US. So, okay, so the way that we're going to go through this webinar, we're going to present, just sort of round everything in the importance of user experience, or UX for short, to digital accessibility efforts, discuss some of the challenges of traditional UX activities and methods when focused on accessibility for people with disabilities, and then introduce an approach that we've been using for a few years now at TPGi we call AT user flow testing, as a way to provide agile feedback from assistive technology users. And we'll talk a bit about how we do that. Isabel and I will both kind of share our perspectives, how the method works, how we run a particular testing process, and then chat about how we can integrate the methodology into the digital product development lifecycle, the different ways that you could use this method to complement other digital accessibility efforts. So let's start off exploring this connection between UX and accessibility. And often when organizations start thinking about digital accessibility, there's a strong focus on standards like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG for short, or the Section 508 standards as definitions or sets of requirements for digital accessibility. So these become a real focus of effort. It does making sure a product conforms as far as possible to WCAG or Section 508 or EN 301, 549 or other accessibility standards. And these standards are very helpful in that they're a formal and generalized distillation of what we've learned and what we know now is needed to avoid digital accessibility barriers. They're the results of long, complex processes of understanding where barriers exist and what to do to avoid them. But they also have some limitations. While they're incredibly useful as the setting this baseline, they do have some limitations because standards are generalized distillations of what we know to be best practice. They don't consider the context of use of a digital resource. The standards don't really take into account why somebody is using, what success looks like when for a particular digital resource, which may be very different depending whether it might be, for example, an app to use to get your get results from a health examination versus an online game. Very different purposes, they're very different contexts of use. Mm-hmm. So conformance with technical standards doesn't guarantee an equal or effective user experience for people with disabilities. It's very much a baseline that you can then build on accessible UX efforts. So that's one challenge that we want to try to address. It's important to look at legal compliance. I mean, whether we like it or not, legal compliance is a big driver for accessibility efforts online. And what's helpful when we focus on user experience is that legal compliance tends toward user experience. When we look at anti-discrimination laws protecting people with disabilities around the world, these laws tend to focus on real-world activities. For example, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, sets obligations to ensure that people with disabilities can access services, programs, and activities provided by public entities. That's Title II of the ADA, and access places of public accommodation, places like restaurants or shops or other facilities provided by private organizations, as in covered by Title III. So in both cases, it's all about access and use rather than necessarily compliance with or conformance with a particular technical standard. That might be in the weeds in the laws, but it's certainly the fundamental aspect is equivalent access and use of real world things. In Europe, the European Accessibility Act, the EAA, provides accessibility requirements to ensure that product manufacturers and service providers are created in such a way as to, and I quote, maximize their foreseeable use by persons with disabilities. So again, while the EAA presents a number of requirements, fundamentally, it's focusing on maximizing use or usability, user experience. So their two important pieces of legislation are ultimately talking about the extent to which people with disabilities can use something in comparison to those without disabilities. And regardless of any legal obligation that an organization may be under, it's just good sense to build products, digital products and services so that they are usable by as many of the intended audience as possible. So you're not obliged by law to make a product that's usable and useful, but it certainly makes good business sense to do so. So really there's a strong focus on going beyond technical accessibility conformance to focusing on user experience. So thinking a little bit about some user experience UX activities that might help with those accessibility efforts, there are a number of different ways for digital product teams to gather perspectives from users of a digital resource that's being designed, ways to include perspectives of people who are expected to be able to use a digital resource. For example, when the goal is to establish product requirements, it's useful to perform activities like contextual inquiry interviews or focus groups or surveys, ways to gather research about a particular problem that a digital product is trying to solve. Understand how people you want to be able to use this product currently try to complete a task, or the problems that they encounter, the way they work, the way they perform workarounds, or if something, there's no such thing exists, then again, gathering information from people on parallel situations just to help provide perspectives and help confirm that the idea that if we build this product, people will use it because it's going to be useful for them. It's testing that assumption and figuring out whether that's correct or whether that needs to be adjusted. So there's a lot of research, exploratory research that can be done to help ensure that a product that's going to be built has the appropriate set of requirements that ensure it's going to be successful. Then when designing and building a solution, it's important to include representatives of the target audience in that process. And that might include co-design activities where you're partnering with members of the target audience and actually thinking about ways to build the resource, maybe evaluating prototypes, whether they're paper prototypes or early functional prototypes. Getting that feedback early on from representatives of the target audience helps ensure that you're headed on the right track. And if you're not, that you can make course correction when it's less costly and less challenging than, say, for much further down the process of building a digital product. And then when the goal is to test that what's been designed or built meets those requirements, then a UX activity that can be used to verify whether that has been successful would be usability testing, conducting task-based usability testing with people as intended users of the product, help you figure out what works well and what doesn't work so well. So there are a number of other activities. I've just shared some examples that product teams can use in general to gather feedback from people who are represented, members of the intended audience, or can speak for the intended audience of a digital product. And when we think about accessible user experience, that's when we really intentionally focus our UX efforts on people with disabilities. Building on that, does it conform with accessibility standards, to answering the question, can people with disabilities use the product or service, and can they do so without undue effort or difficulty? And when we think about accessible UX, we can think about activities that might be exclusively focused on people with disabilities. Maybe you're conducting an activity to gather research from people who have a particular set of accessibility needs or use a particular assistive technology, or you may be intentionally making sure that when you're conducting a survey or a usability test or any other user research activity, that you're intentionally making sure that people with disabilities are part of the wider population that you're recruiting from. So let's say you're building a product that might help people choose a mortgage, and you're wanting to gather feedback from people who are considering making for their first time house buyers, making sure that that group intentionally includes people with disabilities rather than treating people with disabilities as this separate group who are only of relevance when thinking about accessibility, rather than thinking about the problem that whatever it is you're building is trying to solve. It's important that you're inclusive as possible. So that's the objective of trying to bring UX into accessibility efforts and bring accessibility into UX efforts. But there are challenges in doing so. There are challenges of integrating accessible UX activities into design and development. They can demand a lot of resource in terms of expertise, understanding how to adapt UX methods to make sure they're inclusive, making sure that you're not putting up barriers that prevent participants with certain disabilities from being able to take part in a UX activity, or taking part in such a way that the data you collect from them, those participants, isn't helpful because they encounter barriers that shouldn't have been there in the first place. Maybe there's challenges with recruitment. Some teams might find it difficult to find people with disabilities to participate in research activities, or it might take them a lot of time to identify and include people. In general, some UX research activities take a lot of time from start to finish, and the time taken to recruit, organize the study, run the study, gather the information, analyze the information, present the information in a digestible way. In the meantime, development might have moved on to the point that the information, the activity gathered wasn't helpful anymore, or it was too late to act on it. And then there can be also challenges with representativeness of results. Sometimes there can be challenges when UX activities focus on a particular perspective that turns out not to be representative of a wider population, yet a product team might decide to make decisions based on that research, and then go down the wrong road of addressing the needs of a single person rather than a wider group. And without a broader insight into representativeness, then accessible UX insights can then create more problems than they solve. So that's a background that brings us into talking more about AT user flow testing, which is a method that we at TPGi used to gather, you make that connection between accessibility as a technical endeavor and UX as a people-focused endeavor. And it's a method that we use and provide as a service to our clients. And other organizations in the accessibility and UX field might do something similar, but call it something slightly different. There's no one single name for the method that we're going to talk about, but we know it as AT user flow testing. And we're now going to go into talking a bit more about what it is, what we do, and how it can be integrated into the product development process. So just as a highlight, if I was going to give the elevator pitch for AT user flow testing, it's really a rapid way to gather feedback on user experience direct from one or more person with a disability. It's scoped to real world and business relevant interactions, each with a defined start point and an end point. So it's all about expected flows that are relevant to the organization and relevant to the digital resource being built. It becomes a way to understand the impact and task completion of accessibility barriers and user experience issues encountered by people with disabilities. And because it helps you understand the impact on task completion, it helps you identify what works well and what needs fixed, and then what needs fixed first. So it's a really useful way of prioritizing issues that are encountered. One of the challenges of testing against accessibility standards is that not all accessibility barriers are the same. and a barrier that might exist that might technically be a high priority to fix based on its priority level in the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, for example, in reality might not be something that people encounter, or might not stop them from being successful in task completion, whereas another barrier might seem technically or at face value to be less significant, but turns out to be something that's has a much greater impact on task completion. So it helps you put technical accessibility testing results in context. It's a lot more, compared to usability testing, it's a lot quicker to perform because it's much more tightly defined, fewer people involved, more focused on one or two tasks, and it's focused on that sort of business relevant goal. So again, it goes from the theory of technical accessibility conformance to the practice of, is it possible for somebody to complete this task? And if there are barriers in the way, how severe are they? So that's my perspective. Isabel, wondered if you want to share your thoughts on the real values of AT user flow testing, from your perspective as a developer and assistive technology user.
I think really it's just a great way of ensuring that your products and applications work for people with disabilities. It's different from standards conformance testing because an application can be technically accessible, but practically really difficult to use. So developers can do things like, for example, if a low vision user is trying to use an application and all of the foreground and background color combinations pass the WCAG tests, but they still might clash with one another, or they might just be very difficult to read for somebody with low vision or a reading disability. So even though you've done all your legal stuff, you've made sure that it passes WCAG, but you in a real world, users can't read the text, or like there are other things like if I was using a stocks and shares website, I've had I've had them where the ticker is announced constantly. And the developer, and I can get why they've thought, oh, this is a great idea. Blind people will know what's going on all the time. But the ticker is announced on top of anything else that I'm trying to do. So if I'm trying to move around the application and find a specific menu item or something, I can't do it because the ticker is being constantly announced. So it makes the application unusable. So this is the kind of stuff that AT user flow testing will pick up.
Yeah, I like that sort of focus on the context of use. You're discovering barriers while trying to perform a task or complete a task, whereas technical accessibility testing, you're kind of looking at components or pages in isolation, and maybe with a little bit of effort you can think about an issue. Oh, when might people encounter this, and how might it affect them? But standards testing generally doesn't make it easy for people to think more broadly about the context of use. So yeah, that story about the stock ticker is a really good example of that.
But I don't think we should, downplay the value of standards testing. It's a
Oh, sure,
brilliant starting point. It's just
absolutely.
not enough by itself.
And this is a way to build on that without a huge amount of expense or effort or time required to get that next level of feedback. So I'll talk a little bit in a high level about the method, and then in a couple of slides, we're going to work through an example, an example user flow, and chat a bit about the approach and what sort of things we might find when we do some testing. But in essence, the method for AT user flow testing is firstly to identify one or more user flows that a digital resource is intended to support, and for which you want to find out can a person with a disability complete this flow? And this exercise is really helpful in its own right because it allows you to scope the testing and also make clear, well, how would somebody, what would be the optimum path from start to finish for completing this task? So it's a way to figure out if this is hard to do, then maybe there's some UX rethinking to be done in the product itself. So even this first step of identifying flows that the resource is intended to support could be, that's something that we've found in some cases people find it surprisingly difficult to come up with flows, which speaks to a possible concern over what are the expected usage patterns of this digital resource. Then once you have those flows, and it could just be one that's the focus of a study, it could be 2, 3, 4. Break each flow down into very discrete steps. Now, this is essential in terms of defining how you would expect somebody to go through that flow from start to finish. This is where the method differs from a usability study, where you're effectively telling somebody, you're giving somebody the high-level task and asking them to figure out how to perform it and hoping that the resource is designed in a way to make it easy for them to figure out what to do. With AT user flow testing, we need to break each flow down into very discrete steps to the point of telling somebody when to click on or where to click on a link, what data to add into a form input field, just so that you're very clear in providing instructions for how somebody should interact at each point in that flow. So there, the flow is clear, very specifically prescribed, and that makes it easy for multiple people to perform the same flow, and then you can compare. You know that people went through the same steps. You can compare whether one person performed better than another, which can be helpful in figuring out whether an issue is significant or whether it was more something that one person identified but others didn't. And then once you have each flow broken down into discrete steps, one or more participants with a disability then goes through each flow step by step, noting any issues that they encounter, the impact of the issue on their task completion, and any workarounds that might be attempted. In some cases, an issue might occur and somebody can figure out how to get around that using a particular screen reader hotkey or some other tactic. And it's important to figure out how did a tester overcome an issue to help figure out, would other people identify that solution? Is that a solution that an expert would identify, but a beginner wouldn't? Just figuring out what workarounds did a tester apply to help understand the severity of the issue. It's important in that process also for the tester to record details of the browser and the assistive technology, including the version they used, just to make sure that all of that technical information is logged and appropriate, again, to allow comparison and further investigation if there is an issue that requires more detailed technical exploration. Once the testers have gone through each flow and recorded the results of their testing process, a UX reviewer would independently verify the results, do some additional inspection, and sort of contextualize the issue in terms of what went wrong and what recommended remediation advice might exist for the product team members to act on. So here we've got a partnership between the testers who are reporting on their experience, and then that kind of UX perspective to put the test results in context and explore potential usage. It can also be handy for somebody who's sighted to visually inspect something that a tester who's a screen reader user encountered difficulty with, and you compare the visual experience with the non-visual experience. Typical outputs from user flow testing, AT user flow testing. Firstly, is the tester's experience. So what we do at TPGi will give each tester a results sheet, with every, a table with every step of each flow, and a place to record whether that step was completed without difficulty or whether an issue was encountered. If so, what was the impact of the issue? What workaround, if any, was performed to get past the issue? And then an opportunity for the tester to describe the flow in their own words in terms of whether the issue was, whether any issues encountered really caused problems or were just minor irritations. And additionally, as well as any written information, screen and audio recordings that the tester might take while they're performing the test can provide additional illustration to help show an issue, show it, rear itself and have that impact. So that's the tester experience. And then the UX analysis could be illustrated issues, screenshots, and additional descriptions, maybe applicable WCAG success criterion if there is one, and remediation guidance. What would be the best way to solve a problem? Is it a code fix, or is it something that requires a more significant rethinking of a component, or maybe it's a content issue, rewording instructions or labels, for example. So there you get that sort of raw experience from the tester plus the UX analysis, and typically we'll combine that into a Word report or a PowerPoint presentation, and then provide those to our clients, along with any audio recordings or screen recordings that might help illustrate issues. So at this point, we'll give, just to make things a little bit more real, we'll use an example user flow, and just what Isabel and I will chat through the process and talk about some of the things that we might expect to find, or based on previous experiences, things that we have found. So here's an example flow, and this is, let's say we're working with an e-commerce website. And our flow is select an item of clothing and add it to the shopping cart. So, Isabel, just talk through, firstly, what would you expect that flow to look like? What sort of activities and interactions would you expect to be included in that user flow?
So I would expect to have some sort of maybe a drop down with different categories of item. It would depend what sort of a store it was. If it was just a clothing store, then the categories would obviously be just clothing. So say if I wanted a pair of jeans, for example, I would find that and I wouldn't know whether I was looking for a menu or a drop down list or like a sidebar. I wouldn't quite know what I was looking for. So I would hope there was a heading that would tell me what was there. So I'd go find that, and hopefully there would be a section for denim or jeans or something. I'd be able to click on that and it would open up something maybe underneath or maybe in the main section of the page. And so I would try looking underneath denim and see if it opened another little sub menu, or I would go to the H1 heading to see if I could find. I would kind of just have to look around because I wouldn't quite know what I was doing, and I think if I could see the screen, it would be a lot more obvious.
Mhm.
So I would hopefully find what I'm looking for in the main page, and I'd be able to filter them down and subcategorize them by size and color and style and that kind of thing. And then I'd be able to choose one and add it to the basket.
And that's
And
a good point. One additional way that we can make user flow testing work for different scenarios is to include a couple of error conditions in a flow, rather than make it limit it to the simple flow of select a pair of Levi 501s, size whatever 10, and then add them to the cart. Then what happens if there's none in your particular size? So we might design the user flow to deliberately trigger an error condition to make sure that user experience works well. So, I mean, is that talking about error conditions? How would you typically expect those to be handled, and what sort of notifications would you be expecting?
I would want the screen reader to just announce because in case I missed it on the screen, because it's going to probably come up in red somewhere and I'm going to miss it. So I just want the screen reader to say there are no Levi 501s in your size, and maybe offer me alternatives or something.
So I like that sort of the offering alternatives. Then there's the user flow testing is kind of helping you figure out how best to recover from an error and how well the site kind of anticipates what information you might need to move on. You know,
Yeah.
in a clothing store, typically, yeah, you might say, well, that's all I wanted. That's the only brand of jeans I ever wear, so I'm going to go somewhere else and get them. Or you might think, oh, okay, I'll see what else is available and is there anything on sale or whatever. So again, defining the user flow is a way to help think about the user experience and think about what people might do on encountering an error and moving forward.
And it might also be a way to keep the customer on the website because I know if a site is really accessible, I'm a lot more likely to stay on it and find some alternative than to go off to a site that's not quite so accessible.
Right. And that's the key point of the AT user flow testing. You're kind of behaving as a customer as opposed to an accessibility tester. You know, you are an accessibility tester, but you're in the shoes of a user as opposed to, again, going back to our standards conformance thing. It's more, you know, you're doing accessibility testing. Here you're thinking and behaving as if you were a user, even if it's in a particularly controlled way, but it's definitely a pivot to the role that you're playing in terms of reporting issues and impact.
I do think in your head you become that user. I know I do when I'm doing tasks now.
Yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
that person wanting to do the task.
So when we think about a flow like this, where you're adding, you select going through a collection of products, selecting one and adding it to a shopping cart, what sort of issues might you expect to identify that would be less easy to pick up from an audit or a standards-based accessibility review?
Oh my goodness. Like I said before, if I had low vision, if I could say a little bit, color would be quite important, and ensuring that things were grouped together visually in a way that I could see. With a screen reader, things like buttons or controls that have really long accessible names. So I've seen um, a menu button that says click here to open a menu with items of clothing. Right. Oh my goodness. Just say clothing menu or something. It takes such a long time to listen to that stuff, and the important thing is right at the end. And I've been filling out a form and I've got to the submit button and it said something like click here to send us the form you have just filled out. Everyone knows what submit means. Just say submit and I'll be able to do the task faster.
And I
Especially
imagine,
if you're having to come back and if it's a task I'm going to repeat on this clothing website, click here to add these Levi jeans to the basket you've created or something. Just add Levi jeans to basket.
yeah, that's a great
So,
example because in a WCAG audit, somebody might flag it as, yeah, it's a bit long for um, a name for a label, but it doesn't fail. So
no,
somebody will
so
see that, okay, it passes, great. But here, you as a tester are saying, that's super annoying. That's gonna really annoy me. So there, the dynamic changes. It's like a user saying, this is really gonna affect my experience, and there's a solution to this problem. So it's again showing the difference between bringing that UX perspective to what is still an accessibility focused activity.
yeah, and to say if the jeans were described, and you told me how much cotton was in there and how much viscose or whatever, but you didn't actually tell me what the jeans looked like. The description would pass WCAG, but it wouldn't be any use to me. So it's
And
just
again,
thinking through things from the perspective of the user that you're trying to serve.
and in the context of use. Here it's a fashion site, people wanting to buy something to look good. So this is an opportunity to provide that feedback. So I mentioned workarounds a few moments ago. Can you give some examples of when you've been testing and you've encountered an issue, but you've been able to perform a workaround? What's an example, and how important is it to indicate or give you a sense of how likely it is other people would be aware of that workaround and use it?
So quite often when I've opened a drop down, so it's a custom drop down, and I want to press the down arrow to get to the first element in that list, and keep pressing the down arrow to move through them, and it just doesn't work. So I don't hear anything. I'm pressing my arrow keys and I can't hear anything. So what I have to do is, JAWS has a kind of a mouse simulator. So I can actually move the mouse around with JAWS, and it'll tell me what's underneath the mouse. So I engage this JAWS mouse scenario, and I move. I can use the arrow keys to move it around, and then I'll find the element in the drop down that I want, and I'll simulate a mouse click using JAWS. Now, if I didn't, I don't know what I would do if JAWS didn't have that functionality. I wouldn't be able to use that workaround. It's clunky. I use it a lot actually, and I don't think I don't think a beginner would know how to do that. I think it would take you to be an intermediate user to understand how that works.
So
It
that's
also
an
takes you to
example.
have a lot of patience. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah. So there's an example of where there's functionality that an intermediate to advanced user could try out when encountering an issue, and they think, this could be a solution to this issue. But for somebody who doesn't recognize the issue as one that could be solved by that tactic, or doesn't know that it's even possible to do that, then for them it's like, I can't get past this. I'm stuck. I can't go anywhere. So AT user flow testing is a way for the tester to say, there's a barrier here. I was able to get past it by using this technique, but this is an advanced technique, and we can't assume that we can't say this is okay. We'll just leave it as it is, because it's gonna block some people from moving on. So it's a good example of how you can sort of give an impact rating for an issue that you encounter that isn't necessarily the same as the level A or level AA or level AAA that you get in WCAG. It's much more, what was the impact on you completing a task, and how hard was the workaround you to figure out what workaround might exist, and how to implement it, and how aware other people would be. So that seems like a really good way to show how this way of interacting can help identify high priority issues that might not be obviously high priority if you were using a standards-based test. Any other sort of observations on the importance of reporting issues in effective ways that you can think of?
I think you make a good point that the level of WCAG fail doesn't often bear resemblance to the impact. So I wish I could remember what it was. I've recently come across an issue that didn't fail WCAG. It was a pass, but it was a blocker, and I couldn't continue with the task.
So it's helpful to know that exists, that scenario exists, and that a conformance doesn't necessarily mean it's usable, but together, conformance testing plus some form of UX activities such as AT user flow testing can get you that perspective on whether an assistive technology user is able to complete a task without difficulty.
Those tickers that we're talking about earlier, that would be another example of something that passes WCAG
Right.
and totally blocks the user.
And I guess even if it's not a blocker, but it's just something that's unduly complex, again, this kind of this sort of testing approach can help you understand whether it's just really difficult to use this custom feature to perform this task when there's an easier way to do it. You're even if the custom feature is technically implemented in an accessible way, it could still just be really slow and difficult to use.
There's really simple things that can trip a user up. Like, um, there used to be all websites used to have an edit box around about on the top right somewhere for searching, but now they've taken to having a button that you press to open the search up. And that took a lot of getting used to for me because JAWS has a feature for jumping to the first edit box, and that's how I used to find search, but I can't rely on that anymore. So things like that can really trip up a user.
I think that's really interesting in that you have, and I imagine many assistive technology users will have lots of learned workarounds. When something's not quite right, there's almost this mental list of things, techniques to try, or even techniques to try straight away. So when they don't work, or they work in an unexpected or work, they lead to unexpected consequences. Then again, that's something from a UX perspective that the digital resource designer would want to know about and make adjustments to. So, that was an example of how a particular user flow can identify where we might want to be paying attention to a number of different UX focused issues that wouldn't necessarily be encountered through an automated or manual accessibility review. And we're going to just sort of move towards the end of the webinar just by thinking about some different ways to use AT user flow testing. And I guess there's a couple of different ways that we can look at the value of this method. Firstly, if a resource already exists, you've got a website that's out there, and maybe you know there's some accessibility issues, or you suspect there's UX issues that are going to adversely affect people with disabilities. One quick way to gather information to help persuade people, maybe people who write the checks or approve more advanced accessibility activities, is to demonstrate the impact of barriers on those business critical task flows to stakeholders who have an influence, who can decide, yes, we do need to test this. And this is the difference between telling somebody who doesn't know much about accessibility standards, oh, we're failing success criteria 4.1.2. Oh, well, what does that mean? So what? But to have an AT user flow test result to show that somebody found it difficult to interact with a custom shopping cart component because of the way it was implemented, that can help it make the difference, make the problem real in terms of business impact. Here's somebody who tried to add a product to the cart and couldn't because of the way it was developed. And that, to somebody who's focused on throughput and making sure that customers can purchase things with minimum friction, that's pretty compelling information. So AT user flow testing can help you as an accessibility advocate provide evidence to somebody who needs to be persuaded that there's an issue that needs to be addressed. Secondly, for resources in development, this is a very effective and quick way to identify information around barriers early in product development and provide that feedback at a time where it's quick and less compelling, less challenging to make those product changes. And then once development has been completed and hopefully accessibility efforts have been included in that development process, it's a way to verify that accessibility efforts have been successful. It's effectively user acceptance testing from the perspective of people with disabilities. So it's, in that case, the value of AT user flow testing is to show there are no problems or only very minor problems, and that tasks are completed successfully without undue effort. So just to close up, let's share some tips for effective use of this method. And I think one of the first tips is one, Isabel, you and I talked about this a little bit earlier, engaging with testers who are aware of their own expertise. I mean, you talked a bit about workarounds and knowing how many, who would likely know this workaround. That sounds like something that's really important for testers to be aware of their own capabilities and be able to explain.
And
Yeah,
sorry, and limitations.
yeah. So it works both sides. It's like, an advanced user might figure out a way, but I can't,
Yeah.
or I figured out a way, but somebody who's less experienced probably wouldn't. It's really important so that the tester is not speaking only from themselves, but kind of thinking about their experience compared to others. And that takes a little bit of knowledge and self-awareness. Sometimes we're not always great as humans of predicting how others will behave based on our own experience. But the more you can have somebody who can speak to their level of experience, the more effective the results are. Be careful when defining steps of a flow. When you break down a flow into specific steps, you need to make sure the steps are written in accessible language. If you're asking a screen reader user to click on the red submit button, well, as long as they can identify it's a submit button, but if you're assuming that somebody can distinguish color, or you're using other visual descriptions, or you're even referring to something in very technical terms, um, uh, so you're using language that is more that is advanced language that a developer would know when you're referring to different parts of a user interface. That can make it difficult for a tester to figure out, well, what does this bit mean? So being consistent and careful when describing each step helps avoid testers encountering challenges. One of the biggest values of this method is the speed with which it can be performed. So focusing on a quick turnaround, especially when you're integrating it as part of an agile development process, helps make sure that you're providing timely feedback. Again, and I speak from experience as somebody with a background in UX research, it can be really sort of your instinct is to design everything perfectly and take every cross every T and dot every I. But sometimes people need rapid feedback in order for it to be useful to them at the time, the most appropriate time. So, be aware of the agile nature of this method. You don't need polished deliverables, but providing feedback on issues is the most important way. Speaking of which, creatively capturing and sharing results in a way that has most impact for your audience is a really valuable a way to ensure that the method has impact. We talked about a sort of standard method where the tester independently performs the flow and then provides their results. Then the UX specialist kind of puts them in context and shares the results with the audience. But maybe there's an opportunity for a live user flow test if the tester is willing to have people watch what they do and test something in real time. That might be a way to engage a certain product team. Maybe people respond more to watching a video of somebody interacting with an application rather than reading some written results. So thinking about different ways of capturing and sharing results that has the best chance of persuading your team to act. And being aware of the limitations that AT user flow testing provides. This is not formal usability evaluations where testers are following a defined process. So they're not kind of having to figure out what to do, but more reporting on a predefined user experience. Neither are they full accessibility conformance reviews. Testers report from the perspective of a particular disability or accessibility profile, so can't speak for other users who have different accessibility needs. But otherwise, we think that this is a really effective addition to an accessible product design and development strategy, and we encourage its use. So just to summarize, AT user flows can really help you integrate UX feedback from people with disabilities at different points in the development workflow. And the value is very much on simplicity, speed, and a focus on real-world tasks, so that there's the information provided is really business relevant. And they can either be used to find issues or verify that issues have been successfully removed. Either way, AT user flow testing provides a significant value to accessibility and UX efforts. So I'm just going to finish up by looking at some the Q&A to see if there's any questions. Bernard Tyres, thanks for your question. An interesting method, quite different, like you said, from usability testing. I'm going to work out if we can try this method in my work. I don't know if this is a valid question. What happens if the steps you've broken the user flow down into don't match the steps the user follows or attempts to follow? Or is that where the UX designer may need to do some research or work to improve that user flow? Is this also where the workarounds become relevant? Well, I guess the first answer is ideally the tester should follow the steps.
Yeah.
If the tester is deviating from the steps, then that's a conversation to have. Why did they do that? And was it that the steps weren't articulated properly? Or is there something about the steps that just make it hard to understand? Isabel, any addition to that answer?
Yeah, I think it could be useful before you give the user the steps to ask them how they think they might complete this task.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because we talked earlier about breaking down the flow into constituent steps might make it apparent that, oh my goodness, this is taking a lot longer than we expected. Or this is more complex. There's 93 steps, I'm exaggerating, 23 steps to add a product to the cart. Could we do it in fewer? So yeah, it can be an opportunity for the team when defining that step, that the flow in specific steps. Is it more complex than we intended it to be? And if so, can we simplify it before we make it available for testing? So Bernard, yeah, your question is, really, it does create this opportunity to review whether a particular flow is as complex or as simple as you hoped it would be. Samantha Ye asks, do you have any recommendations for how to find testers? This is a great question, and finding people with disabilities to participate in any UX research can at first point seem challenging, but there are lots of different ways to tackle that question. One is to advertise internally with your organization, saying, we're looking for participants who use assistive technology, who have particular accessibility adjustments to take part in testing. Obviously being mindful of what somebody's job duties are and whether they have the time. But it can be a really effective way of harnessing expertise and lived experience of people with disabilities within your organization in a productive way to help build a product. If you're looking outside of your organization, there are lots of organizations, independent living centers, other groups that people with disabilities identify with or are part of that you might be able to ask. If you are looking externally, then it's important to think about how recognizing the effort that somebody might put into doing testing, providing compensation, maybe a gift card or some other way to recognize somebody for the time that they've given. Ideally, we'd see this as something that is part of somebody's job. You have people with disabilities within your organization are doing this as part of their work, and that's a recognized part of their work. But equally, it's a method that can be used by bringing in people from outside. Isabel, any additional thoughts on that before we finish up?
Yeah, I've got tripped up before when I've been recruiting user testers because we offered them an amount that was incompatible with the benefits that they were on because they weren't working. So you need to think about things like that.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Just thinking about that, the impact and what's fair and equitable and appropriate, and is it going to cause a participant challenges? But certainly, I think people with disabilities are more aware of UX and digital accessibility as something that needs attended to. So there's a greater awareness of what you're looking for, and hopefully more people who are willing to help, as long as you recognize the effort and the expertise that they bring to product development.
And I think
So I
if
know
you
we're
want
at
them to
time.
come to you, sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
you
Sorry.
might need to pay expenses for people to get to you.
Exactly. So I know we're at time, and I just want to finish up by sharing a slide with a QR code that links to TPGi's webpage that describe our AT user flow testing. If you'd like to know more about how we do things and maybe talk to us about how we can help you, then we'd love to have that conversation. Otherwise, this is a method that's available that anybody could adopt as part of their accessibility and UX strategy. So we wish you all the best with your UX efforts. Thanks again for joining us today. Thank you, Isabel, for partnering with me on this one. And have a good day, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.